William Elming, and as Paul said, I've been here at the IFS for about 1.5 years. I work in something that's called the direct taxes and welfare sector, where we do a lot of stuff on direct taxes, obviously, and some applied policy analysis. So that's part of the job that we do. We look quite a lot on the recent, for example, the recent proposed benefit reforms over the last year, and I myself has worked how these benefit reforms have interacted with this newly proposed national living wage. So that's some of the stuff we do, but on the other hand, in the direct taxes and welfare sector, we also do, as Paul said, quite a lot of academic work, and I am currently working on 2 different academic projects. One that has to do with how long-lasting are the effects of tax audits, which we do in collaboration with HMRC, and another project where we look at the gender wage gap across the life cycle. So that's just briefly to introduce who I am and what I look at in my everyday life. But today, I'm going to talk to you about labor supply and taxes. So this is really a topic that has a huge impact on many people's life, and it's a topic that's hugely studied in public and labor economics. And why is this? Well, it's easy to think about that it's a topic that has a significant policy interest. So for example, if you want to think about questions such as how should we design the tax and benefit system to encourage individuals on the margins of the labor market into employment. So this is obviously a question that has a huge interest in the policy arena and for many people. So this has both, if you can induce people to move into employment, you'll have both large benefits for the individual. We know that being unemployed is associated with large disutility costs for different individuals, and will also have a big benefit for the exchequer. Obviously, if you move a guy from being on benefits, that is a net expense for the exchequer, into employment, into him making an earnings and paying taxes, then this will have a huge impact for the public finances. It's also a topic which can help us think about what are the consequences of raising the top income tax rates. So this is something that's been very widely discussed over the last years here in the UK and in many other countries. And hopefully, or later on in this presentation, I'll introduce some work that's been done looking at the introduction of the new 50p tax rate. You can also think of understanding how taxes affect labor supply is central to understanding how many of these interesting labor market phenomena that we've been observing over the in the real economy. So for example, we've seen a substantial increase in employment rates among women, and we see often discuss this, how labor cycle fluctuations is important for driving business cycle fluctuations. So to understand some of these phenomena, it's important to understand how taxes and benefits affects individuals' labor supply decisions. So what am I going to do today? So today, the plan for this lecture is to start by outlining a very simple model of labor supply with proportional taxes. This is to help us think about what are some of how does such a simple model look like, and how can we try to think about this problem. Then I want to discuss some alternative methods of identifying taxes and labor supply, and hopefully along the way I'll introduce some empirical work that's been done within this field. Then the idea is, at the end of this presentation, to briefly introduce and talk about some of the large reforms to the benefit system that has been proposed within the last year, and think about how does these reforms to benefits affect individuals' incentives to work. I'll also try to talk a little bit about this new national living wage very briefly, and how we might think about this also, how this affects individuals' decisions. But before we get started, it's instructive to just kind of introduce some of these basic notions and that we'll be using today. So first and foremost, how should we think about measuring labor supply, and how should we even think about it? So when we talk about labor supply, do we think about the extensive margin, that is whether individuals work or not? If that's what we're interested in, then obviously employment might be a good empirical measure. But we know that individuals do not only choose whether to work or not to work, they also choose how much to work. In fact, we know there's quite a lot of variation, particularly for women, in how much they work. This is particularly true during child-rearing years, where we see for women, child-rearing is often associated with taking time out of the labor market and or working part-time. So when we talk about and when we think about labor supply, we might also think about this extensive margin, intensive margin. So are we interested in how many hours individuals work? But what about effort? So there might be differences even within the same number of hours worked in how hard people choose to work. And also when we think about labor supply, should we think about it as an individual decision or as a joint family decision? We know that spouses' labor supply decision affects individuals' decisions whether to work or not, particularly if there's children present in the household. And finally, we might also want to think about like quality adjusted labor supply, in that there might be differences in the type of labor that individuals supply in terms of their human capital, that is their education, for example, and the amount of training that they have had. So this is just to kind of discuss that when we talk about labor supply, it's important to be precise in just what aspects of labor supply are we interested in, and how do we go about measuring this. And how should we think about the effect of taxes on labor supply? So from Econ 101, we know that, let's say there is a tax decrease, and we know this will have both an income and a substitution effect. If you decrease taxes, then people will substitute leisure for work, because it's now more attractive to work, because they get to keep more of their earned income. So this substitution effect will make people work more if you decrease taxes. But we know that there will also be an income effect. So if you decrease taxes, then for the number of hours that I'm already working, I'm now richer, because I get to keep more of my earned income from those hours. And if I'm now richer, I might want to work less. So there's this substitution effect that makes me want to work more, and then this income effect that makes me want to work less. So how does changing these taxes affect individuals' labor supply? So what we tend to do is we try to summarize this labor supply reaction with an elasticity measure. So we try to balance out or find out how these two counteracting forces balance out with each other, and summarize the reaction in such an elasticity measure. So the focus here in the next couple of slides will be looking at the intensive margin, so that is how many hours do individuals work in a static framework. But here it's kind of important to understand that there's many different elasticity concepts, and it's important to think about which one is the relevant one for what I want to study. Indeed, many of the differences you see in the empirical literature, so that is differences between the estimates that people uncover, can be attributed to data measurement issues or the way researchers specify their models. And the final thing that I want to mention before we get started with the model is it's also important to think about long-run versus short-run elasticities. So if you think about a huge tax reform, if you go about measuring how much of people reacted in the following month after the tax reform, you might find a very small elasticity, that is, that people don't really react. But it might be that in the longer run, when people have had time to adjust their behavior, so if there's rigidities in the market, or if there's some things that affects people's ability to react, then you might find very different long-run estimates of the elasticities relative to the short-run estimates. So this is also something to think about. What kind of elasticity are we interested in? Okay. So if we want to consider a very simple static model of labor supply, then if you have proportional taxes tau t, an individual I with characteristics and preferences VIT over consumption and leisure, then if you can think of this very simple model where the individual wants to maximize his within period utility that depends on the consumption, the leisure, and that is dependent on the characteristics and preferences the individual have. Obviously, they'll get more utility from increasing their consumption and from increasing their leisure. We think of this simple utility maximizing problem as being subject to this budget constraint that simply says that the consumption has to be equal to this other non-labor income plus the total time available net of the leisure, so that is the number of hours worked, times the marginal net of tax wage rate. So if we have such a simple model, we can derive a labor supply function that depends positively on this net of tax wage rate. So that is, if I earn more per hour, I'm maybe more likely to work. That's what we're going to figure out. And then it depends on this other non-labor income and these personal preferences and characteristics. So under certain conditions, we will have an interior solution for the number of hours to work. That is, people would choose to work a positive number of hours. But we also have a possible corner solution. That is, individuals might choose to work 0 hours. So we can think of it that individuals will only work if their net of tax rate is higher than some reservation wage. So this reservation wage depends on the relationship between the marginal utility of leisure relative to the marginal utility of consumption evaluated at 0 hours. So why is this intuitive that this reservation wage depends on this fraction between these two marginal utilities? Well, you can think of it as an individual just loves having time off work. If he just loves leisure, then obviously this fraction will increase and his reservation wage will increase. So it'll take a very high net of tax marginal wage rate to make this guy work if he just absolutely loves leisure. Conversely, if this guy loves consumption, then we see that he'll have a lower reservation wage. That is, it will take a lower wage for him to make to work. In that if he loves consumption, then he'll have to work to increase his consumption that he loves. This is why I'm just trying to throw on some intuition to this expression. So what we also see from this is that taxes unambiguously reduces the probability of working relative to a scenario where we'd have the taxes are equal to 0 in this simple model. That is, when you introduce taxes, then the probability that the individual has a wage rate that is higher than his or her reservation wage decreases. Okay. So what about these elasticity concepts? So what are the different kinds of elasticities that we think about? We think of there as being this uncompensated Marshallian elasticity, which we simply define as the percentage change in hours when the net of tax wage rate increases with 1%. So this is one of these key elasticities concepts that we're interested in. We also think about this compensated Hicksian elasticity, that is this substitution effect that we talked about before. So by the Slutsky equation, we can decompose any response, any elasticity response, into both an income effect and a substitution effect. Note here that this compensated elasticity, this substitution effect, determines the distortionary cost of taxation. So why is this intuitive? Let's try to think about a world where we have a very high elasticity of substitution. That is, people are very responsive to changes in their net of tax wage rates. So if you increase the tax rate by a little bit, then if people are very responsive, then they'll respond by reducing their number of hours worked a lot. So if you have a very large substitution effect, then increasing taxes a little bit will distort people's choices a lot. This is why this is in some ways intuitive that this substitution effect, this compensated elasticity, determines these distortionary costs of taxation. This is also why, to understand how responsive are individuals to changing the tax rate, then we are naturally very interested in identifying some of these key concepts. So in the next couple of slides, I'll try to walk you through both some ways you might think you might want to identify these effects and some more successful avenues to go about identifying these key concepts. Okay. So how might we go about estimating this? So the simple model that we've just looked at suggests that hours worked is a function of marginal net of tax hourly wage rates and other income. Okay, so if we have this simple model, why don't we just go out and get some cross-sectional data and run a simple regression where we have the number of hours worked is equal to a constant plus some function of the net of tax marginal wage rates, other income, and some observed characteristics. So if we have this simple model that predicts that there is such a relationship, why don't we just get this data and run this regression? Well, there's many reasons why we might think that this might not be a good idea. So we can think of there being a selection problem. So typically, we know that to run this regression, we need to observe the wages of individuals. We only observe the wages of individuals who are in work. So of the people, so to run this regression, we can only use the guys who are in work to run this regression, whereas we do not observe the wages of the individuals who are out of work. We do not know for these guys who are out of work, what would their wages have been had they been in work. So there's a sample selection issues in that if we want to run this regression, and if we only use the guys who are in work, we might think of the guys who have a particularly high wage, because as we saw before, then you're only working if you have a higher wage than your reservation wage. So for the guys who we do observe their wages might be these high individual wage guys. And if we then run this regression, then we'll get these sample selection issues so that we can't really identify this effect on the marginal net of tax wage rates on the number of hours worked. We can also think of this regression as suffering from an omitted variable bias problem. So if we have, for example, that in this error term, in this unobserved term, in this regression, we have individuals' preferences for work. So we might think of a situation where there's just some guys who just absolutely love to work. The guys who just absolutely love to work, that is the guys who unobservedly have a very high number of hours, maybe they also absolutely love to work when they are in school, such that they became very good and they have a very high wage rate. If it is such that we have something in this error term, so for example preferences for work, that is correlated both with the number of hours worked and with the wage rates, then we have this omitted variable bias where we will overestimate how the net of tax wage rates affect the number of hours worked. Another potential problem we can also think about is that we know in the current tax system we have that we have these progressive taxes. So this might induce reverse causality problems in this equation. So we know that the number of hours might also affect your net of tax wage rates, both in terms of the tax credits you're entitled to, but also just from the fact that high income individuals, so if you work more hours, then your marginal tax rate might increase. So it might be the case that it's not only your net of tax wage rate that determines the number of hours you worked, the number of hours you worked might also be a determinant of your net of tax wage rates through this effect on the taxes. Another potential problem in this equation is that to run this equation, we need to get information on the individual hourly wage rate. So here in the UK, we would typically do that by using some sort of survey. So there's an abundance of surveys that contains information on what are individuals' hourly wage rates. In some of these surveys, we know that they are prone to measurement error. So for example, in what we call the Family Resource Survey, we ask people what are your weekly income and what is your weekly number of hours worked, and then to get the hourly wage, we divide the two by each other. But we know there's big measurement issues in the number of hours worked. So if we have these measurement errors, then this might result in an attenuation bias, that will bias this beta towards zero, again evaluating any inference from this simple equation. Luckily, we also have other surveys where we have better measures of hourly work. But if we are in a world where we have measurement error, this could be a potential problem for this regression framework. We might also think about non-hours response, but I'll defer that to the later discussion where we talk about this concept that's called the elasticity of taxable income. Okay, so this was a relatively unsuccessful way of how we might go about identifying these effects of net of tax wage rates on the number of hours worked. So how else might we go about finding this effect on taxes on labor supply? Well, one approach that's been used widely in the literature is to try to use some quasi-natural experiments, that is to use some exogenous variation created from tax reforms. So the idea here is to use some tax reform that affected some treatment group but not another, but didn't affect some control group. So let's try to think about a reform, for example, where we decrease taxes for the very high earners. So this will only affect the very high earners, whereas the medium high earners will not get affected by such a tax reform. So the idea here is to contrast how does this reform affect this treatment group, these high earners, but by using the information both for this treatment group and from this control group, that is the median earners. So what we typically apply, or one approach that we can use, is this difference-indifference approach. So the idea here is to take these guys, these high earners, who are affected by this cut in the marginal tax rates, and then we can compare how does that affect the labor supply before the reform and after the reform. So we have, for these treatment guys, the high earners who had their taxes cut, how was the labor supply before the reform and how was the labor supply after the reform. So obviously within this response, the effect of the reform, we can find some information on the effect of the reform. The problem is, however, if we only look at this response of the high income guys, and let's say if the reform happened in the middle of some boom years, so if we introduced the reform in, let's say, 2005 or something, when the economy was booming, then if we compare the responses between 2004 and 2005 for these high income guys, we'll find that potentially that the labor supply increased a lot. This might both be driven by the fact that there was a tax reform, but it might also simply be driven by the fact that the economy was booming, so that everybody's labor supply was increasing. So to kind of net out this boom effect, the fact that the economic environment was changing between the 2 years, we might also use information for these control guys, for these medium high earners, who also saw their labor supply increase because of these boom years. So between 4 and 5 for the medium earners, they might also have seen their labor supply increase. Then we can use how did the labor supply change for the guys who were treated by this reform, that is the guys who benefited from this tax cut, and then contrast it with how did the labor supply change for these guys who were not affected by the reform, but who were also affected by this economic boom. Then if we take this difference and compare it to this difference, that is, if we difference this difference, the difference in difference, then we can kind of net out this boom effect and isolate this reform effect. So that was kind of an attempt to intuitively describe this difference in difference framework. Seem awfully quiet, all of you. Are you kind of following me what I'm saying here? And yes, this is all trivial to you guys. Okay, so this is the intuition behind this difference in difference approach, which is used widely in the literature. Okay, so the key assumption here is this common trends assumption. So we can only use the control guys to difference out this boom effect for the treatment guys if the treatment and control group were similarly affected by the boom. So you might think of a situation where between 2004 and 2005, the economic boom only benefited the very rich and not the medium earners. Then if we try to use the medium earners to difference out this boom effect, and if they were differently affected by this boom, then we cannot basically difference out this. So this is why this common trends assumption, that is that both the treatment and control guys were similarly affected by the economic environment, is very important, which we will return to below here when we consider an empirical example. So one paper that has tried to use this difference in difference framework is, for example, a paper by Isa from 1995, where she tries to evaluate how high-income women was affected by the 1986 tax reform in the US. So this tax reform, under this tax reform, high-income women saw large reductions in their marginal tax rates. So again, when they see these large reductions in their marginal tax rate, we know they will have an income effect. They are now richer, which will make them want to work less, and it will have a substitution effect. They now get to keep more per hour worked, which will make them work more. So what was the total effect of this tax reform of on these high income women's labor supply? So ISA here finds this treatment group, which is these married women in the 99th percentiles of the earnings distribution, and as control, she uses married women from the 75th percentile. What she finds that there is a small increase in hours, but there's large participation effect for these treated high-income married women. So why might we think there could be some problems with this paper? Again, we might think that the economic environment around 1986, where the economy was booming in the US, might be such that differently affected the control guys, that is the women in the 75th percentile, from the treated women in the 99th percentiles of the earnings distribution. If the economic environment affected them differently, we cannot use this difference in difference framework to difference that change in the economic environment out. Over and above this, you can think, even though this common trend support assumption might hold for this example, you can also think that there might be a problem with what we call assaultive matching. So one of the findings is this assaultive matching. What it basically means is that we find that high quality individuals tend to marry other high quality individuals. So in this example, it means that the married women in the 99th percentile of the earnings distribution are more likely to be married to other very high earning men, relative to the women in the 75th percentiles, who are more likely to be married to men around the same percentile. So if it is such that there is this assaultive matching, so that the high earning married women in the 99th percentile were married to these very high earning men, then we know that the treatment group and control group were affected differently by the income effects of these men. So if this tax reform also affected the incomes of the men that these women were married to, so if the high income women were married to high income men, then these high income men also benefited from this tax reform. Whereas the women from the 75th percentiles did not see the same, were not married to these high income men, and they did therefore not benefit from this reform. So if there's differences in the spouses of these treatment group and this control group, then this difference framework might not be able to isolate the effect on the tax reform on the married women itself. You can think of some of these other problems, but let's not delve too much into that. You can see for a bit more of an optimistic, to end on an optimistic note on this difference in difference framework, then there's this paper by Blundell et al. From 1998, where they use this difference in difference framework to successfully identify how the effects on tax reforms on labor supply. Okay, so before we continue to something slightly else, let me just briefly introduce one other approach that's been used in the literature to try to identify the effects of taxes on labor supply. So one thing that's been used is these more discrete choice, these structural models, where researchers try to discretize the employment choices of individuals, for example, by modeling whether the individuals work full-time, part-time, or not at all. So the main advantage of this strand of the literature is that it is able to identify these deep labor supply parameters of interest. So you can find, if you set up these models correctly, it can help you identify parameters which we don't think change over time. So once these parameters have been identified, so that is, for example, the risk aversion or the discount factors and some of these deep parameters which we don't think of as changing, once these have been uncovered, then the powerful thing about this type of models is that they can be used to potentially simulate the effects of hypothesized policy reforms. So you can use these models not only to evaluate the policy reforms you see in the real world, but also try to come up with counterfactual policy reform and estimate how these might affect behavior. The drawback of these models is that they require some very restrictive assumptions on the preference and error terms, and they are often quite complicated both to set up and to estimate. So there's this paper by Brewer et al. That examines the 1999 working families tax credit reform here in the UK and how that affected the labor supply of lone mothers. What this paper finds is that the reform increased employment rate of lone mothers by around 5 percentage points, but only slightly reduced the labor supply of couples with children. There's a very good survey in a paper by Richard from 2007. Okay. So remember in the introduction we talked about how going about measuring this intensive labor supply. We talked about that hours might not only be the way to think about how much people work, how intensive people work. There's also other margins on how individuals might respond to tax and benefit reforms. So you can think that individuals might choose to work harder or less hard. There can be this intensity of effort. Or you can even think that different tax systems affect how people choose to invest in human capital, so both in formal education or on-the-job training and so forth. And you can also think about how tax reforms affect income shifting. So there might not only be real responses where people choose to work more or less, people might also simply choose to shift income across time or across types of income in response to different tax reforms. So there's this new responsiveness literature that suggests instead to look at taxable income rather than, say, hours or employment. The idea here is that taxable income is a proxy for total effort. By looking at how much taxable income does individual earns, then this will take into account both if individuals choose to work harder or less, or if they move income forward in time, or if they shift income backwards in time. So the key concept within this literature is this elasticity of taxable income. So the definition of this concept is that if the net of tax rate increases by 1%, then how much does taxable increase by in percent? So in a world where, let's say, we have a 30% tax rate, so my net of tax rate is 70%. That is, for every pound I make, I get to keep 70p. So if that increases by 1%, so that if it's now 70.7p I get to keep on every pound, how many percent do I choose to change my taxable income? So that's the definition of this key concept, this elasticity of taxable income. So what Feldstein in 1995 argued is that why this is such a key concept is that this elasticity of taxable income is a sufficient statistic. That is all we kind of need to look at to consider the welfare analysis under some conditions. So that this elasticity of taxable income can really be used as a summarized measure to kind of broadly understand how people respond to tax reforms. It's also been criticized, though, that the elasticity of taxable income, this ETI, is not what we call a deep economic parameter. So remember in the previous slides we discussed that some of the advantages of these structural models was that they could uncover some of these deep parameters that doesn't change over time. Well, this is not necessarily the case for this elasticity of taxable income, as it very much depends on the setup of the tax system. So if you're in a tax system where income shifting or avoidance opportunities are large, then this will affect your elasticity of taxable income. So you might find, be in a situation where you find that people are very responsive to, in terms of the elasticity of taxable income, so they have a very high ETI to tax reforms. That does not necessarily mean that raising taxes is a bad idea. It could just mean that you ought to do more to try to limit the opportunities that individuals have to shift income or avoid taxes in other ways. So the basic of this approach within the literature is basically to use this summary parameter and then try to again find some how the taxable income of some group affected by some reform changes compared to some unaffected reform. So again, trying to go align this difference in difference framework. So to illustrate how this ETI is both estimated and how important it is to find the right size of this ETI, let's consider this example of the introduction of the 50p tax rate. So in the budget of 2009, the then government introduced this new 50p tax rate, 50p rate of income tax for those with incomes above 150,000. Crucially, this reform was introduced in the budget 2009, but was not due to come into place until April 2010. So this reform only affects less than 1% of the adults, but it affects some of the individuals in society that we know can be very responsive to tax reforms. So at the time, Her Majesty's Treasury scored this as increasing tax revenues by 2.7 billion a year when you've taken behavioral responses into account. How much the Exchequer gained from this reform was estimated or calculated to be 6.8 billion if you didn't take these behavioral responses into account. So this large difference between the pre-behavioral response and the post-behavioral response indicates that HMT was already forecasting this reform to be affecting some type of individuals that could potentially be very responsive to such a reform. So in the budget of 2011, the Chancellor asked HMRC to produce a report to evaluate how much was the 50p tax rate actually raising in revenues. This report suggested that the previous estimate by HMRC was a substantial overestimate and that the 50p tax rate in fact only yielded about 1 billion in revenue. This new estimate was based on a revised estimate of this elasticity of taxable income, and this revised estimate was based on using this reform to look at how individuals actually responded. So one important point here is to point out how sensitive this 1 billion number is relative to the estimated elasticity of taxable income that you get. So to kind of illustrate that, consider this table here. So this table here on the left has different sizes of the elasticity of taxable income ranging between 0.2 and 0.5. And these two columns shows how much revenue did this 50p tax rate raise under two different assumptions. So the first column here is under an assumption where indirect tax revenues are unaffected. And the second column here is when you assume expenditure falls as much as income. So when you increase the 50p tax rate, people respond by lowering their income. And depending on what you assume about people's consumption following this drop in income, then it will have very different revenue impacts, as if you assume that expenditure falls as much as income, then receipts from VAT or food duty and etc. will also decline. So this table is merely just to illustrate how sensitive the estimated revenue is to this ETI. So we see that the rate estimates ranges between 4.1 billion raised by this 50p tax rate to a negative cost of 1 billion to the Exchequer by introducing this new and 10p higher tax rate. So we see that if you assume that expenditure falls as much as income, and if you have an ETI in the range above 0.45, then introducing this new tax rate actually makes the Exchequer lose tax revenues. Okay, so how did HMRC actually estimate this elasticity of taxable income? Well, to find out how it affected the incomes of these very high earners, so the incomes of these individuals earning above 150k, then they needed to work out what would the incomes of these high earners have been in the absence of this new 50p rate. They worked this counterfactual income out by using information on the income growth of the group with incomes between 115k and 150k in the years before and after reform. So that is, they used the information on how did the incomes evolve of this control groups that had incomes just below the 150k. And then, because many of these very rich or very high earning individuals also owns a lot of stock, they also use information on stock market growth before and after the reform. So there's a number of reasons why this might be a bad idea, and or why this is challenging to do in practice. It could be, for example, that if people respond to this reform by reducing their incomes below 150k in response to this reform, then you could increase the total income of this control group with incomes between 150k and 150k, and if the reform does that, then using these guys' information to figure out what these guys, the affected guys' income would have been in the absence of reform might be a bad idea. Okay, a final thing to note before we actually go to the results of what HMRC found out is that, remember, this reform was announced in the budget of 2009 but did not come into place until April 2010. So these very high earning individuals had a full year where they knew for a fact that in the following year their tax rate would increase from 40 to 50p. So this induced them to shift forward income, so the individuals who had the opportunity to bring forward income did so. So in order to successfully estimate how did this reform affect the very high earners, you also need to take account this forestalling, this bringing forward of income. And indeed, HMRC estimates that these very high earning individuals brought forward between 16 to 18 billion to 2010, that is before the new 50p tax rate was introduced. And this is particularly important for the individuals who had the opportunity to do so. So for example, individuals who had some sort of dividend income where you can kind of shift income across time relatively easy. Okay, so what did HMRC actually estimate the elasticity of taxable income to be? Well, they found a central estimate of 0.48. So what does this mean? This means that if the net of tax rate rises by 1%, taxable income rises by 0.48%. So this is what led them to suggest that this 50p tax rate increased revenues by 1 billion relative to the 40p tax rate.
Wasn't it 45?
No, it's 40 and then went up to 50, and then the Conservative government introduced the new 45p tax rate. Okay, so what I would really like to point out here, what is really the essence of this whole thing is that even though they found this central estimate of this 0.48, then the standard errors of the analysis were large, such that there was only 2/3 of a chance that the true elasticity in the model was between 0.14 and 0.81. So if we go back to the table we had before, so you can see 0.14 is all the way up here and 0.8 something is all the way down here. And if you see how much revenue varies across this range, and if there's only 2/3 of a chance that the true elasticity is between here and here, then what they're really saying is it's really hard to estimate, and it's a very uncertain but best guess that they came about by doing this. Okay, but overall, it's a very reasonable attempt to try to estimate this elasticity of taxable income. They find a similar estimate to the central IFS estimate, which is around 0.46. But as I said, this estimated elasticity of taxable income really depends on the avoidance opportunities and the opportunities to, say, shift income and how you make assumptions about how much income did these guys actually bring forward from later years. So you can see more on this elasticity of taxable income in this paper by Sayers from 2012. Okay. In the last remaining minutes, I just want to briefly introduce these benefit reforms and how we might think about they affected work incentives. So as part of his deficit reduction plan, then the Chancellor aims to eliminate the deficit between 2015 and 2020. So the government plans to cut annual benefit spending by around 12 billion by the end of the parliament. So they've introduced a number of cuts. Some of them, for example, they've introduced the cuts to universal credits for those in work. In the summer budget, there was also some cuts to tax credits proposed to come into place in April 2016, but these were rolled back in the autumn statement. They've introduced a 4-year freeze to most working age benefits, and they've cut the credit amounts for new claimants with children coming in from April 2017, which will especially affect families with 3 or more children. At the same time, they've also introduced this new and higher minimum wage, this national living wage, where the narrative was, at least in the budget, that this new national living wage should to some degree compensate for some of the cuts to benefits. So in the fall, we put out a report, which I helped make, and which basically showed that there might not be as much truth to this narrative as the politicians had hoped. But the focus here today is how could we think about these different reforms affecting work incentives? Well, they introduced a lot of cuts to out-of-work benefits. Well, this will induce individuals to work more. So if you cut the benefits you get out of work, then you now have a lower income, which will make you want to work more. And you get to keep more if you do decide to move into work. But at the same time, these cuts to in-work benefits will weaken the incentives to work. How did the national living wage affect work incentives? Well, if there's not strong income effects, then you know this new national living wage, this higher hourly wage, will induce individuals to work more hours through this substitution effect. But at the same time, something we haven't discussed today is we should not only think about this labor supply effect, but we also must remember that there is a labor demand effect. So when you introduce this new and higher national living wage, firms might want to hire less workers or offer less hours. So that is, since it's now more expensive for firms to offer that extra hour of overtime or hire this extra guy, they might reduce their labor demand. So how does all these counteracting factors play out? Well, some recent work we've done is that in total, if you take the taxes and benefit reforms, this new national living wage, and the move to universal credit, we'll see on average a slight strengthening of work incentives. It's important though to point out that this will be different for different groups. For example, we know that lone mothers will see their work incentives weakened. And we know that lone mothers are a group that is particularly responsive to changes in work incentives. Okay, I think I'm about out of time, so to conclude, then understanding the effects of taxes and labor supply is crucial for many areas, both in policy and to understand some of the bigger questions about some of the labor market trends we see. Identifying, though, these effects are very tricky. So we saw the simple example in the beginning where in both endogeneity and selection is a problem for this simple cross-sectional linear equation. And we've seen in discussing this treatment in difference in difference and these using these policy reforms to try to identify the effects can also be hard because of both this common trends assumption and other possible challenges. Despite all these problems, there is a relative consensus on how labor supply responses are for different groups. So we know that prime age men are very unresponsive in the intensive and extensive margin. That is, prime age men tends to both work and work full time. But we know that the taxable income elasticity is around 0.2 to 0.6. So they do respond along other margins. We see that married women are more sensitive, particularly on the extensive margin, that is whether to work or not. And we see that the present and age of children in households are important for households' labor supply decisions. So if you're more interested in this very exciting research agenda, then you can see more on these papers by McGee and Phillips, who also work here at the IFS, and another paper which possibly is a bit more exhaustive is the Blundell and McCurdy one. You've been very quiet. I hope that it's because you found it also interesting and you understood everything. But I'm more than happy to discuss with any of you if you have some questions afterwards. Thank you.